Ramon Novarro defied his family and fled his home in Mexico. A sumptuous paradise known as the Garden of Eden for the dark and dangerous world of Los Angeles. He was handsome, athletic, charming, and talented, but like so many others, good fortune played a role in realizing his dream of becoming a star, and what a star he became. By the late 1920s, he was MGM's leading man. His star faded. His name was forgotten. He turned to alcohol, and then one fateful day, a member of his staff arrived at the Novarro home to find a brutally shocking scene. This is the story of the dramatic rise and fall of Ramon Novarro. Before we pull back the curtain on this dark secret, I'd love to know where you all tuning in from. Get your favorite drink ready, get settled, and stay with me as we navigate the scandalous lives and tragic ends of the stars we thought we knew. To understand the Hollywood tragedy of the man who would become Ramon Novarro, we must first look far beyond the glitter of Tinseltown, back to a time and place that seems suspended in a dream. It begins not in the chaotic sprawl of Los Angeles, but in Durango, Mexico, a place the locals reverently called the Garden of Eden. Born on February 6, 1899, as Jose Ramon Gil Samaniego, he was the firstborn son of a wealthy and prominent family. His father, Dr. Mariano Samaniego, was a prosperous dentist, and his mother, Leonor, was a woman of intense piety and artistic ambition on the surface. It was a life of privilege. The Samaniego household was a fortress of tradition, religion, and high culture, seemingly impenetrable to the outside world. But history has a way of shattering even the most beautiful sanctuaries. The year 1910 marked the beginning of the end for this paradise. It was not merely a change in the calendar. It was the eruption of the Mexican Revolution, a violent upheaval that would tear the fabric of the nation apart. The overthrow of President Diaz plunged the country into chaos. And suddenly, the Garden of Eden was besieged by bandits and revolutionaries. The untold story of Novarro's youth is one of sudden, traumatic displacement. The family, once protected by their status, found themselves targets. The comfortable silence of their upper-class life was replaced by the terrifying sounds of gunfire and the constant threat of violence from dispossessed peasants rising up against the elite. This historical trauma left a permanent scar on the young Ramon. The journey from the stability of Durango to the uncertainty of the United States was harrowing. In 1916, at the age of 17, Ramon and his brother, Mariano, boarded a train north, leaving their childhood behind forever. The journey was fraught with danger. At one point, they were stranded in a small town, surviving on dry tortillas and unclean water, paralyzed by the fear that the rebel leader Pancho Villa might raid the town and cut off their ears, a specific, gruesome fear that haunted the young musician who dreamed of hearing applause, not screams. When the rest of the family finally followed in 1917, the sights that greeted them were straight out of a nightmare. As their train chugged towards El Paso, the windows framed a horrific tableau, dead bodies hanging from telephone poles along the route. This image, grim and unforgettable, was a terrifying reminder of the violence they were escaping, a visual imprint of death that perhaps prepared Ramon for the darkness he would later encounter in the classic cinema industry. However, the external chaos of the revolution was matched by an equally potent internal pressure, the dynamics of the Samaniego family. To understand the psychological makeup of old Hollywood stars like Novarro, one must look at the parents in the Samaniego household. Affection was a currency that was rarely spent. Herbert Howe, who would later become Ramon's publicist and secret lover, observed a chilling lack of outward warmth within the family. Compliments were non-existent. If a family member performed a kindness or gave a gift, thanks were offered only to God, never to the person. This emotional restraint created a primal wound in Ramon, a deep-seated belief that his actions, his talents, and his very self were unworthy of direct validation. He learned early on that love was conditional and that credit belonged to the divine, not the human. This emotional void would later drive him to seek the adoration of millions to fill the silence left by his parents. His mother, Señora Samaniego, was the shaper of his destiny. She was the one who introduced him to the arts, teaching him piano at age 6 and envisioning a future for him as a concert pianist. But her influence was intertwined with a suffocating religious devotion. The children knelt every night to receive her blessing, elevating her status to that of a living saint. This environment cultivated a classic Catholic guilt complex in Ramon. He was a boy torn between the spirit and the flesh. At 16, inspired by his sisters who became nuns, he seriously contemplated a life of martyrdom and sainthood. He fasted, slept on the floor, and kept his eyes lowered in humble submission, a performance of piety that earned him mockery from local children. Yet, even then, the performer in him was awakening. The lure of the opera, with its opulent costumes and grandeur, tempted him away from the monastery. He later joked that it might have been the devil tempting him. But this conflict, between the saint he wanted to be and the star he was destined to become, would plague him for the rest of his life. The escape to Los Angeles in 1917 was the final severance from his old life. Ramon arrived in a city that was exploding with energy, a wild frontier town transforming into the dream factory of the world. But for a young Mexican immigrant, the reality was harsh. The Garden of Eden was replaced by the pavement of poverty. Despite his aristocratic background, Ramon found himself at the bottom of the social ladder. He worked as a grocery clerk and a busboy at the Victor Hugo restaurant, clearing tables for the very celebrities he aspired to join. The golden age scandal of his life began here, in the shadows of his struggle, desperate for money and determined to succeed in the arts. Ramon made a choice that stood in stark contrast to his priestly aspirations. He took a job posing nude for art students at the J. Francis Smith School of Illustration and Painting, in an era when nude modeling was considered scandalous and morally bankrupt. This was a dangerous gamble for a young man who had recently slept on the floor to prove his holiness. Standing naked before strangers was a profound psychological shift. He rationalized it as art, convincing himself that artists were not bound by conventional morality. This was the beginning of the compartmentalization that would define his existence. He was learning to wear masks: the pious son, the struggling immigrant, the daring artist. This period was not just about survival. It was an education in the ruthless nature of show business. He faced rejection after rejection. He was handsome, athletic, and talented. But so were thousands of others flooding into the city. He was an extra in the crowd, a face in the background of films like The Jaguar's Claw and The Woman God Forgot. He tried to ham it up to get noticed, only to be dismissed by directors. The poverty was grinding. He famously recalled almost losing hope. But the hunger for fame, perhaps driven by that deep-seated need to be thanked and validated that his family denied him, kept him going. He was a survivor of a revolution. And he was determined to survive Hollywood. Little did he know, as he posed for those art students or cleared dishes at the restaurant, that he was on the precipice of a transformation. The young José Ramón Gil Samaniego was about to die, and from his ashes, the silver screen deity Ramon Novarro would rise, but the ghosts of Durango, the hanging bodies on the telephone poles, and the silent, thankless dinners of his childhood would follow him into the spotlight, laying the groundwork for a tragedy that would unfold decades later. The transformation of the starving immigrant busboy into Ramon Novarro, the prince of the silver screen, was not a fairy tale. It was a calculated act of industrial manufacturing. After years of scraping by on the fringes of the industry, enduring the humiliation of rejection and the physical exposure of nude modeling, the machinery of classic cinema finally decided it had a use for him. But in the ruthless ecosystem of the 1920s studio system, actors were rarely hired for their talent alone. They were often pawns in a larger game of power. His big break arrived in 1922 with The Prisoner of Zenda, a swashbuckling romance set in the mythical kingdom of Ruritania. However, the untold story behind his casting reveals the cynical nature of Hollywood. Director Rex Ingram, a titan of the silent era, didn't just see a handsome face in Ramon, he saw a weapon. Ingram was locked in a feud with the reigning Latin lover, Rudolph Valentino, who was becoming increasingly demanding and difficult to control. Ingram reportedly declared his intent to make Ramon a star specifically to teach Valentino a lesson, to show the arrogant idol that he was not indispensable. Ron was drafted not as a unique artist, but as a replacement part, a threat to keep another star in line. Even his name was a fabrication. Ramon Samaniego was deemed too ethnic, too difficult for American tongues. He became Ramon Novarro, partially due to a typo, with the studio spelling it with an O instead of the traditional A. Thus, the man was erased, and the brand was born. Ingram's molding of Ramon Novarro was obsessive. He styled Novarro to be a mirror image of Valentino, even measuring the placement of the part in his hair to ensure it was identical. This was the beginning of the great persona construction. On screen, Novarro was the dashing villain Rupert of Hentzau, radiating danger and charisma. Off screen, he was terrified. He knew that failure in this role meant the end of his career before it truly began. Fortunately, The Prisoner of Zenda was a massive hit, and the critics raved. But the mask was already beginning to tighten. The studio needed a heartthrob, a man who could make women swoon and men jealous. They needed a blank canvas they could paint with their own fantasies. The pinnacle of this manufactured ascent came with the casting of Ben-Hur 1925, the most expensive and ambitious production of the silent era. The role of Judah Ben-Hur was the most coveted in Hollywood. And initially, it wasn't Ramon's. The studio had cast the all-American George Walsh, only to fire him in a humiliating public spectacle when production stalled in Italy. When producer Irving Thalberg called Ramon to offer him the role, it wasn't a request. It was a summons. But even as they handed him the crown, they tightened the chains. Thalberg demanded that Ramon screen test immediately, when Ramon boldly refused. Thalberg acquiesced but countered with a brutal financial stipulation. Ramon had to temporarily suspend his studio contract. This meant no pay raise for starring in the biggest movie of the decade. And shockingly, Ramon had to cover his own living expenses while filming overseas. It was a Hollywood tragedy in the making. The star of a multi-million-dollar epic was being financially squeezed by the very moguls who would profit from his face. The making of Ben-Hur is a treasure trove of old Hollywood stars trivia, revealing the physical toll exacted on performers. The famous chariot race, a sequence that still thrills audiences today, was a chaotic and deadly affair in one heart-stopping moment. Ramon's chariot crashed and was overturned by a pack of horses. Spectators screamed, fearing the leading man was dead. Miraculously, he emerged from the wreckage without a scratch, a testament to his athleticism and sheer luck. But the danger wasn't just accidental. It was often directed. In a scene where Ben-Hur is adrift at sea, Ramon was forced to endure bitterly cold conditions for hours, clad only in a flimsy garment, while his elderly co-star suffered alongside him. The cruelty of the directors was even more personal. During a scene where a Roman soldier pulls Ben-Hur by his hair, assistant director Al Rabosh demanded take after take. He forced Ramon to endure the physical pain of having his hair yanked 36 times. Finally, breaking point. Ramon showed Rabosh the handfuls of hair falling out of his scalp and refused to do it again. This was the reality behind the glamour of physical abuse disguised as perfectionism, an exploitation framed as opportunity, while the cameras rolled. Another performance was taking place off-camera, one that constituted a major Golden Age scandal waiting to explode, to maintain the illusion of the virile Latin lover. Ramon had to hide his homosexuality. The studio and Ramon engaged in a sophisticated campaign of deception. Enter Herbert Howe, a powerful publicist and writer for Photoplay magazine. Howe was not just Ramon's PR man. He was his romantic partner. Together, they crafted a masterful fiction. Howe wrote glowing articles about Ramon, brushing off their constant companionship by calling Ramon his best traveling companion. They planted stories of romances with female stars, which were quickly denied to keep the mystery alive. Ramon participated in these lavender dates, appearing at speakeasies and premieres with actresses like Alice Terry or Elsie Janis to provide cover. It was a necessary survival tactic in a deeply homophobic era. Yet, unlike many who crumbled under the pressure, Ramon found a way to navigate this duality for a time. He lived a double life, the devout Catholic boy who knelt for his mother's blessing, and the gay man who found love in the arms of his publicist. But the strain of wearing the mask was immense. He was selling a fantasy of heterosexual romance to the world, while legally and socially prohibited from expressing his true self. By 1925, Ramon Novarro was a global phenomenon. Ben-Hur premiered to roaring standing ovations, breaking box office records worldwide. He was MGM's golden boy, generating millions for the studio. He had the fame, the adulation, and the Garden of Eden seemed to have been regained in the hills of Hollywood. But the foundation was rotten. He was a star built on a typo, a replacement for a rival, a financial victim of his bosses, and a man whose public identity was a complete fabrication. As the Roaring Twenties roared towards their end, the cracks in the pedestal were already forming. The era of sound was approaching, and with it, a new set of enemies that would not be as forgiving as the silent camera. The Latin lover was about to face a world that no longer needed him to be silent, but would punish him for who he truly was. If the 1920s were a dream for Ramon Novarro, the 1930s were a rude awakening. The arrival of sound in 1927 didn't just add dialogue to films, it shattered the mystique of the silent gods. For many old Hollywood stars, the microphone was an executioner. Novarro, however, possessed a beautiful singing voice. MGM initially marketed him as the golden voice of the silver screen for his talky debut in Devil May Care. Critics were surprisingly kind to his accent, and the film was a financial success. But the machinery of Hollywood was shifting gears, and Novarro was about to be caught in the teeth of the gears. The first enemy was the studio system itself, a ruthless corporate entity that viewed human beings as depreciating assets. By 1932, the Great Depression was gnawing at box office receipts. Louis B. Mayer, the tyrannical head of MGM, demanded pay cuts from his stars. Tellingly, while legends like Clark Gable and Greta Garbo were spared, Novarro was on the list of those asked to sacrifice their earnings. It was a subtle corporate signal his stock was falling. The roles that followed were a series of baffling missteps orchestrated by the studio. They cast him in Daybreak as an aloof Austrian officer, a role that alienated his fan base, and stripped the film of the songs that were his greatest strength. They put him in The Barbarian and Laughing Boy, films that were savaged by censors and critics alike. The studio he helped build was now actively dismantling his career through incompetence and neglect. The betrayal culminated in a meeting that exemplifies the cold-blooded nature of classic cinema politics. In 1935, Novarro was summoned to meet Eddie the Fixer Mannix, MGM's brutal enforcer. Mannix was not a man of art. He was a man of bottom lines and buried bodies. He told Ramon in no uncertain terms that MGM was buying out the rest of his contract. The message was clear: your career is over. After 15 years of loyalty, after generating a staggering $31 million for the studio, a figure surpassed only by Joan Crawford, Ramon Novarro was discarded with a severance check of $19,000. The Hollywood tragedy here is not just the loss of a job, but the erasure of identity. He was the penultimate original MGM star to be forced out, leaving the lot with a smile for the press, claiming it was a time of wisdom and happiness. But inside, the Prince of Her was dead. While the studio system was the external enemy, the internal enemy was far more dangerous. This untold story of Novarro's life is dominated by his private demons, specifically the toxic cocktail of alcoholism and repressed sexuality. The exact moment his casual drinking turned into a dependency is blurred, but it coincided with the stalling of his career and the death of his brother in 1929. Alcohol became his coping mechanism, his only escape from the suffocating pressure of his double life. He was a devout Catholic, raised to believe his desires were a mortal sin. Yet he was a gay man with physical needs he could not pray away. This created a destructive cycle. He would drink to numb the guilt, drink more to gain the courage to seek out sex, and then drink again to drown the shame of the encounter. His nights became a dangerous game of Russian roulette, played on the streets of Los Angeles. Novarro would drive his car while heavily intoxicated, cruising well-known pickup spots to find men. He was no longer the glamorous star on a lavender date with Alice Terry. He was a desperate, lonely man hunting for connection in the dark. This behavior led to multiple car accidents, incidents that were hushed up or smoothed over, but the physical toll was undeniable. In one horrific Golden Age scandal that never made the papers, a doctor happened upon one of Novarro's crashes. He found the star unconscious, his tongue swallowed. The doctor saved his life by pulling his tongue out and injecting alcohol directly into him to revive his system. The accident left him with broken ribs, a concussion, and a dislocated ankle. But even this near-death experience didn't stop the drinking. In a display of the self-centeredness that addiction often breeds, Novarro expressed zero concern for the other driver he had hit. The conflict reached a breaking point where his religious guilt and his reality could no longer coexist, in a desperate attempt to cleanse his soul. He tried to join the priesthood at El Retiro. It was a heartbreaking bid for redemption. He wanted to trade the screen for the altar, hoping that the structure of the church would save him from himself. But the church, like the studio, rejected him. He was told he was too old, too famous, and perhaps too tainted by his role as a Latin lover. He wasn't holy enough for the church, and he wasn't young enough for Hollywood. He was stranded in purgatory. To make matters worse, the political climate of the 1930s turned against him in a bizarre twist. Novarro found himself labeled a communist sympathizer merely for making an innocent donation to a union for hungry farm workers. The district attorney threatened legal action, and although other stars like James Cagney fought back aggressively, the accusation hung over Novarro like a dark cloud. It was another reminder that the Garden of Eden was long gone. The innocent boy who hosted puppet shows was now a suspect, a drunk, and a has-been. By the late 1930s, the climax event of his professional life had occurred total irrelevance. He tried to pivot to opera, his first love, defying his fans and advisors to tour Europe. It was a disaster. He failed to make his debut in the way he envisioned, and the venture only drained his finances and spirit. He returned to Hollywood not as a conquering hero, but as a ghost. The phone stopped ringing. The scripts stopped coming. He was reduced to working in the summer stock theater for $200 a week, a pittance compared to the $5,000 a week he once commanded. By the 1960s, the once glorious Ben-Hur had retreated into the shadows of the Hollywood hills. Ramon Novarro was no longer the dashing hero. He was a fragile, aging man living in a canyon that felt increasingly isolated from the modern world. His physical decline was stark. Decades of alcohol abuse had left him with cirrhosis of the liver and a condition that prevented his blood from clotting, leaving his skin perpetually bruised. He suffered from emphysema and painful pleurisy, describing himself as a nervous wreck. The silence of his home was deafening. To fill the void, he turned to the only transaction he had left paying for companionship. He frequently called an agency known as Missouri the Best, writing hundreds of checks to young male hustlers, often. These encounters were heartbreakingly non-sexual. He would sometimes pay these young men just to sit and watch television while he drifted into a drunken sleep, desperate for the mere presence of another human being. A friend looked at his reckless lifestyle, inviting strangers into his home, flashing money, and called it a death wish. It was a chilling prophecy. The Hollywood tragedy reached its gruesome climax on the eve of Halloween, October 30th, 1968. Novarro invited two young brothers, Paul and Tom Ferguson, into his home on Laurel Canyon Boulevard. The brothers had heard a rumor that the old star kept $5,000 in cash hidden in the house. It was a lie that would cost Ramon his life. What followed was a scene of brutality that rivals any horror movie. The brothers tortured the 69-year-old actor for hours. Demanding the non-existent money, they beat him so severely that he choked to death on his own blood. When his employee, Edward Weber, arrived the next morning, Halloween Day, he found a brutally shocking scene. The house was ransacked. Novarro's body lay on his bed, battered and bloody, with his hands bound by an electrical cord. A final, cruel irony lay resting on his thigh, his own silver-tipped cane, a memento from his movie star days. Now a prop in his murder scene. The thieves fled with a pitiful loot, a meager $20 bill they found in his pocket. The aftermath of the murder was a second violence committed against his memory. The untold story of his private life was dragged into the harsh light of a public trial. The investigation revealed the checks to the hustlers, exposing his homosexuality to a world that was not yet ready to accept it. The Golden Age scandal machine went into overdrive. A salacious and entirely fabricated rumor spread that Novarro had been choked to death with an Art Deco sex toy given to him by Rudolph Valentino. This grotesque lie, born from homophobia, overshadowed the tragic truth of a lonely old man beaten to death for pocket change. Novarro's death marked the symbolic end of an era. Just weeks later, the Manson family murders would rock Los Angeles, signaling that the old Hollywood of glamour and safety was dead. The Garden of Eden had not just been lost, it had been desecrated. Ramon Novarro, the man who once raced chariots in the Colosseum, was buried in Calvary Cemetery, leaving behind a legacy complicated by the blood and secrets of his final night. When we look back at the shattered mirror of Ramon Novarro's life, the image that stares back is not just a portrait of a man, but a reflection of the destructive nature of fame itself. We began this journey in the Garden of Eden, a place of innocence and piety. We ended it in a blood-spattered bedroom in Laurel Canyon. The distance between these 2 points measures the true cost of the Hollywood dream. Novarro spent his entire life trying to reconstruct the paradise he lost in Mexico, but instead, he built a golden cage. The Hollywood tragedy of Novarro is that he sacrificed his authentic self, Jose Ramon Gil Samaniego. To keep Ramon Novarro alive, he traded the unconditional love of a family, however cold, for the conditional adoration of strangers. He stifled his own nature to fit a mold cast by studio executives, only to find that when the mold broke, he was left with nothing but fragments. This story serves as a brutal indictment of the classic cinema system and the society that upheld it. It is too easy to blame his downfall solely on alcohol or the poor choices of inviting strangers into his home. To do so is to ignore the systemic machinery that pushed him into those shadows. Ramon Novarro was a gay man, living in an era that criminalized his existence. The old Hollywood stars were not allowed to be human. They were commodities. When the studio system, led by men like Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg, could no longer monetize his youth, they discarded him without a backward glance. They stripped him of his career. And society stripped him of his dignity, forcing him to seek intimacy in dangerous, hidden corners. The Ferguson brothers may have dealt the fatal blows, but the weapon was forged by decades of repression and isolation. The industry that profited from his Latin lover image had no place for the real man who longed for love, leaving him vulnerable to the predators who eventually found him. However, we must not let the Golden Age scandal of his death eclipse the brilliance of his life. Ramon Novarro was more than a victim, he was a pioneer. In a time of rampant xenophobia, a Mexican immigrant rose to become the biggest star in the world. He carried the weight of the massive Ben-Hur production on his shoulders and delivered a performance that still resonates with power and grace today. He possessed a gentle humor and a resilience that allowed him to survive revolutions, earthquakes, and the transition to sound. His legacy is etched in the silver nitrate of film history, in the chariot race that defined action cinema, and in the pagan love song that once charmed the world. Ultimately, the life of Ramon Novarro is a reminder that the brightest lights cast the deepest shadows. He was a man who conquered the screen but could not conquer the silence of his own heart. As we leave the Garden of Eden behind, let us remember him not for how he died, but for the beauty he created while he lived. That is the untold story of the first Prince of Hollywood. Before we go, I have one last question for you. If Novarro had lived in today's world, do you think his story would have had a happy ending? Or does fame always demand a blood sacrifice? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the dark history of Tinseltown, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more.